300 men. That was all Gideon had. Across the valley stood an enemy army so large that scripture compares it to a swarm of locusts. Humanly speaking, Gideon was hopelessly outnumbered. But God was about to do something that would make the victory unmistakable. Before the battle began, God gave Gideon one final confirmation. And what Gideon heard in the enemy camp would change everything. That night, God spoke to Gideon. He told him to go down toward the Midianite camp. But God also knew Gideon was still afraid. So he gave him permission to take his servant, Purah, with him. Gideon quietly descended toward the enemy camp. Below them stretched thousands of tents. Fires flickered across the valley. Weapons rested beside sleeping soldiers. The enormous army appeared unstoppable. Gideon listened. Then he heard two Midianite soldiers talking. One soldier had just awakened from a disturbing dream. He said he had dreamed about a loaf of barley bread tumbling into the Midianite camp. The loaf struck a tent, and the tent collapsed. The other soldier interpreted the dream. He believed it meant that God had given Midian into Gideon's hands. Gideon heard those words, and suddenly, he worshipped. He didn't need another sign. He had heard the enemy themselves acknowledging the coming victory. Gideon returned to the 300 men. But something had changed. The fearful farmer was beginning to disappear. The reluctant warrior was becoming a leader. Gideon looked at his soldiers and said, "Get up. The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Notice the difference. Earlier, Gideon had asked, "Is God really with me?" Now he was saying, "God has given the enemy into our hands." Faith had grown. Not because Gideon suddenly became naturally courageous. His courage came from discovering that God was trustworthy. Now came the battle plan. But Gideon's weapons were not what anyone would expect. There were no swords for every soldier. No shields covering the army. No massive siege weapons. Instead, every man received a trumpet, a torch, and a clay jar. It seemed ridiculous. How could clay jars defeat an army? How could trumpets become weapons? How could torches bring victory? But God was about to turn ordinary objects into instruments of deliverance. Gideon divided the 300 men into 3 groups. Then he positioned them around the Midianite camp. The night was silent. The enemy had no idea what was coming. 300 men surrounded an army. And then Gideon gave the signal. At Gideon's command, the 300 men blew their trumpets. The valley suddenly erupted with sound. Then the soldiers smashed their clay jars. Hundreds of torches burst into view. Imagine the scene. From the darkness came the sound of 300 trumpets. Then hundreds of flames appeared across the surrounding hills. The Midianites woke in terror. They looked around and saw what appeared to be an enormous army surrounding them. Then the Israelites shouted, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." Panic spread through the Midianite camp. God caused confusion among the enemy. The Midianites began attacking one another. The army that had once seemed unstoppable was suddenly running for its life. Gideon and his men had barely needed to fight. God had done what he promised. The victory belonged to him. The Midianites fled toward the Jordan River. Gideon sent messengers throughout the surrounding tribes. The Israelites joined the pursuit. What had begun with a frightened man hiding in a winepress had become a national victory. Gideon had learned one of the greatest lessons of his life. God does not need overwhelming human strength to accomplish his purpose. He needs obedience. The 300 men were not the strongest army. They were simply willing to trust God's strategy. And now the enemy was running. But the story was not over. Gideon would continue the pursuit. And the next stage would test his leadership in a completely different way. Because winning a battle is one thing, but leading people after victory is another. The Midianite army was broken. But Gideon's greatest challenges were still ahead. He would pursue powerful kings, face opposition from his own people, and discover that victory on the battlefield does not automatically mean victory in the heart. And eventually, Gideon's greatest temptation would come, not from his enemies, but from success itself.